Okay, so in the previous episode, we have finished all the composite triggers, so the not and then or trigger. And now in this episode, we're going to be doing filtering. So as we can see, it says that at this point, you can run ps5.py and it will fetch and display Google and Yahoo items in a pop-up window. And so how many use items? It is going to be all of them. And though this is nice, the goal here was to filter out only the stories we wanted. So now we're going to have to write a new function, and it is going to be called filter stories. And it says that it's going to take in stories and then trigger list. And they have already done this for us right here. And so it says that it is going to take in a list of stories and then a list of triggers. And it is only going to return a list of the stories that the trigger fires for. So after completing this one, we should try to run ps5.py and then it should basically work. So how we're going to do this is, as it says over here, it says that it is going to take in a list of new story instances, and what we're going to do is return all the stories with no filtering, which is right here, return stories. So how we're going to do this is, first it says that this function, which is filter stories, has stories and a trigger list. So let's make something for filtered stories where this is going to be basically the end result and where we're trying to return. So how we're going to do this is for all of the stories in the stories, so for story and stories, and then we're going to look at the trigger, so for trigger and trigger list. If the trigger.evaluate for the story then we're going to append it into the filtered stories. So basically this is saying if it triggers for the story, then we're going to append it, and then we're going to break out of this loop. And this is going to be doing it for every story and stories, and then for every trigger. So it is going to see which ones works for it. And then finally, we're just going to return stories, which is right here. And then this is obviously not a story, but this is returned filtered stories. So this is how we're going to store it. So all this that we append it into, it is going to be going into this filtered stories, and then we're going to return that right here. So now let's do Command S and then save it. We're going to go to our terminal and then we're going to run it. And as we can see, all of these have passed. So now that all of our test cases have passed, let's, from PS5 YouTube, instead of doing the test file, let's do Python 3 and then ps5.py. And as we can see, it pulls out right here, and it is all of the most recent news. And so now that we have this, let's do some specified triggers. So it says that right now your triggers are specified in your Python code, and to change them, you have to edit your program. And this is very user-friendly. So we're going to read the trigger configuration from a triggers.txt file. So in here, let's open triggers.txt. And as we can see, this is what we have so far. So right now it is on the presidential election where we're talking about Trump and Clinton and after October 3rd of 2016. Obviously this is a little outdated, and this is what it is currently. So now we're going to edit this. So this is an example file that specifies that 4 triggers should be created and that 2 of those triggers should be added to the list. And the other two triggers are created but not added into the list directly. And so these are arguments for the composite and triggers, which is right here. Okay, so as we can see, for each line, it's either blank, it is a comment with these 2 dashes, it defines a name trigger, or it adds triggers to the trigger list. So as we can see, these are defining the triggers, and then these are just adding others to the list. And so this is basically showing you how you're going to be actually writing these triggers. So it says that the blank lines are ignored and they're just white space. And then comments are so we can read it when we're looking at the code. And then to define a trigger, these are separated by comments. The first element is either the keyword add or the name of the trigger. So right here, as we can see, it's add, and all of these are like T1, T2, T3, etc. And then the second element is a keyword that specifies the type of trigger being defined. So it's either like a title, a description, after, before, not, and, or. And then the trigger addition, this is just a trigger definition that should create a trigger and associate it with a name, but should not automatically add that trigger to the trigger list. And so that is what that add is for right here. And so what we're going to do is this part where we're going to finish implementing read trigger config, which is right here. And there's already code written to open the file and throw away all blank lines and comments. But our job is to finish this implementation, which is read trigger config, and should return a list of triggers specified by the configuration file. So how we're going to do this is we're going to go down to problem 11 right here, and we're going to, this line is the list of lines that you need to parse for which you need to build triggers. And how we're going to do this is, first, we have to have a dictionary to hold the name or the triggers, and then we will have a list to hold the final triggers. And so how we're going to do this is first, we're going to have, let's do a comment right here, and this is going to be a dictionary to hold named triggers. And that is just going to be triggers, and then it is a dictionary, so it is in these curly brackets. And now let's make a list to hold the final triggers. And this is just going to be trigger list, and then since this is a list, it is going to be in these brackets. And so now that we have this, in trigger definitions, it states that the first element in a trigger definition is either of the keyword add or the name of the trigger. And so that is right here. And the second element is a trigger definition, and that's keyword. And then the remaining elements of the definition are the trigger arguments. So it also states that the elements following add are names of one or more previously defined triggers. So in other words, if the first part is add, then the part after it should just be the names of the triggers. So we can say that for line in lines, for right here, you had to build the triggers. So the part is just going to be, first you're going to split it with commas. And then if it is the first element is equal to the word add, then everything after that, so for name in parts after the first one, so 1 colon, we're going to append it. So trigger list dot append, and we're going to be putting it into triggers and then the name part. And otherwise, if the first element is not add, then we're going to split it up into two elements, which are the names of the trigger and then the type of trigger. So what arguments are required depends on the trigger type. And so the instructions right here tell you the what arguments each trigger requires. So it could be any one of these, and we're going to be basically transferring it into code. So how we're going to do this is, if the first part is not add, so else so for example, the trigger name is going to be the first part, so parts 0. And then the trigger type is going to be the second element. And now that we have this, we can see that if the trigger type is title. So if trigger type is equal to title, let's make this like this. Then the triggers for the trigger name, this is going to be the title trigger. Parts, and then it's going to be 2. Okay, so how we're going to do this is for the rest of them, we're going to be basically doing the same thing. So I'm just going to copy this multiple times and then we're going to edit it. So how we're going to do this is, we know that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different trigger types. So instead of saying if, it's going to be elif. So basically it's going to be else if this happens, then something else is going to happen. So I'm just going to copy this 6 more times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now we know that all of them aren't title. So for example, the second one is description. And so for the trigger name, it is going to be description trigger instead of title trigger. And then for the next one, instead of the trigger type being title, it is going to be after. And then obviously it is going to be after trigger. And then the next one is before. So right here it is going to be the before trigger. And then not, so it is going to be the not trigger. This is and for the and trigger. And then finally, it is going to be or for the or trigger. And now that we have all of this, we're going to just return the trigger list. So this is going to be in line with the for, and we're going to return the trigger list. Now let's modify the code within the main function, main thread, which is right here. And so we're going to actually use the trigger list specified in our configuration file. So as we can see, if we scroll right here, it says problem 11, after implementing this, uncomment this line. So we're going to uncomment this line right here. And now let's Command S and then save it. So now let's try running ps5.py and let's see what happens. Okay, so let's exit out of this and redo it. So let's go back to cd cs practice and then open ps5 YouTube. Oops. And then we're going to open the Python 3 file ps5.py. And so it says right here for and trigger. So if we go to what we had right here with all of this, as we can see for the and then or trigger, remember it's not just one part, but there's 2 parts. So we had to do triggers and then part 2, and then so this is going to be part 3, and so we're going to do the same with that below. So, and this is going to be triggers, and then it's going to be parts 2, and then it's going to be triggers part 3. So right here it is also going to be triggers and then parts 2. Now let's Command S, save it again and run it. Okay, now as we can see, it works. And so this is just because there's not there's a lot of new news here that we can see that it has already worked. And as we can see, this is what is happening most recently. And as of today, this is what is happening. And so now we can just close this for now. So in this episode, we have just finished everything from problem 11, which is all part of the user-specified triggers, and we also filtered it. So in the next episode, we're just going to continue on with the last part of this problem.